सरताब कदम है तने सुल्तान ज़मन फूल लब फूल दहन फूल ज़क़न फूल बदन फूल और वल्लाह जो मिल जाए मेरे गुल का पसीना वल्लाह जो मिल जाए मेरे गुल का पसीना मांगे न कभी तेरे न फिर चाहे दुल्हन फूल मांगे न कभी तेरे न फिर चाहे दुल्हन फूल। इमाम अहले सुन्नत Imam Ahmad Raza rahimahullah ta'ala, in this naat he describes the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as a rose, and he begins by describing the whole blessed body of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam like a rose. He says sarta ba qadam, from head to toe, hai tane sultane zaman phool, subhanallah, the master of all times. His body from head to toe is a flower, it's a rose. The flower and the rose being the pinnacle of beauty in the language of poets and the pinnacle of perfection. And so, as if this is insufficient to satisfy the yearnings of his love for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, Lab pool, dahan pool, zaqan pool, badan pool, as if going into a state of spiritual ecstasy. He says the Prophet ﷺ's entire body is a rose. And not just that, then in the state of ecstasy he says that the Prophet ﷺ's lips, lab pool, they are roses. Dahan pool, the mouth, roses. Zaqan pool, the face, the chin, like a rose. Badan pool, the entire person of the Prophet ﷺ, a rose.
Subhanallah.
And then he describes the fragrance of this rose, because if you don't have a fragrance for the flower, that's part of the beauty of the flower. You would perhaps feel that you've been shortchanged if you were given a flower that didn't have a fragrance or a scent. So what's the fragrance of this rose? He says, Wallah jo mil jaye mere gul ka pasina. If you were to acquire just one droplet of the perspiration of this flower, or if she was able to acquire one drop of the perspiration of this flower, mange na kabhi itr, she would never desire for any fragrance, na kabhi chahe dulan phool, or nor would a bride want any kind of flower if she had one drop of fragrance. And this is not just Imam Kalaam-e-Alahazrat just expressing his love. You might say that this is something that he said out of blind love. No, this is an actual description of the characteristics of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Sahaba were able to follow the scent of the fragrance of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam through streets that he'd walked through, and able to locate the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet ﷺ, the most beautiful fragrance and smell emanated from his body, even without the use of any fragrance. The Prophet ﷺ's perspiration, Sayyidah Sulaim radiallahu ta'ala anha, she says that the very famous hadith, the Prophet ﷺ was resting in her home during the day, and she saw beads of perspiration on the Prophet ﷺ's body. And so she started to collect them one by one in a small bottle. And this woke the Prophet ﷺ up. And he asked her, he said, Sulaim, what are you doing? And she said, Ya Rasulullah, I'm collecting your perspiration. And this is something that I'm going to mix into our fragrances. We will mix this into our fragrances, and then our fragrances will become the most sweet fragrances in the entire world. Not just that, this reference to the bride, again, not a coincidence. There are narrations in which someone came to the Prophet ﷺ, said, Ya Rasulullah, I'm marrying my daughter, I'm a poor person, don't have anything to give to her. And the Prophet ﷺ told him to bring a bottle. When he did, the Prophet ﷺ scraped some of his perspiration off his body and put it into that bottle, and he said, go and give her this fragrance.
Subhanallah.
And it was used as fragrance, and it's narrated that house where this fragrance went, from that moment forward, it became known as the house of fragrance. This was the effect of the perspiration of the Prophet ﷺ. And Sayyidina Uqba bin Farqad radiallahu ta'ala, a Sahabi, he had 4 wives. Each and every one of them tried to outdo him in his fragrance. And they searched for a fragrance that would be better than his. After all 4 of them completely lost hope of ever doing this, they asked him, they said, where do you get your fragrance from? We've been trying to find something better, stronger, sweeter than this, and we've not succeeded. And he said, I don't wear any fragrance. This is not the scent of any fragrance. When I was a young boy, I developed spots on my body. And my mother took me to the Prophet ﷺ, and I was told to take my qamis, my shirt off, and the Prophet ﷺ rubbed some of his blessed saliva into my body. And since that day, this is that fragrance that naturally emanates from my body.
Subhanallah.
This is the effect of the Prophet ﷺ's saliva. This is the fragrance of the rose that Alahazrat Imam Ahmad Raza rahimahullah ta'ala describes as the Prophet ﷺ. This is the love that our predecessors had for the Prophet ﷺ. He says that the Prophet ﷺ is a rose, such a rose that if a bride were to acquire 1 drop of its perspiration, she would never long for for any fragrance or for any other rose or flower after this. And roses and flowers normally are found in gardens. What sort of garden would you look to find this flower in? This is where he finishes his poem, and it talks very beautifully. It puts the Prophet ﷺ's family into this most beautiful of frames, this last verse. And he says, Kya baat raza us chamanistan karam ki, Kya baat raza us chamanistan karam ki, Kya baat dhan
أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم